Manga. Whimsical pictures, impromptu pictures, irresponsible pictures, free-spirited pictures. No matter which of the countless literal translations for the combination of these two kanji letters you choose, it immediately makes you think of one thing, and one thing only. Japanese comic books, the land of the rising sun's own take on what stories and pictures should be. It's safe to say that both manga and the Japanese animated film industry that it influenced so much have, over the past 3 to 4 decades especially, become a global phenomenon that has enchanted and fascinated millions upon millions of people worldwide. No matter where you're watching this video from, Asia, Europe, America, Africa, Australia, there is a very good chance that your childhood memories contain at least one piece, no pun intended, of manga or anime that you remember fondly. But with how much the medium has exploded in popularity over the past few decades, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that manga is a somewhat recent invention. That, however, is far from the truth. You probably don't need me to tell you that manga didn't just magically pop up out of nowhere. But what I can tell you is how manga got to this point, how through a centuries-long evolution, it slowly became one of Japan's most successful forms of entertainment, one of the country's biggest entertainment media exports, and a concept that even those with not even a passing interest in Japanese entertainment are at least familiar with. In today's video, we will go on a journey that takes us all the way from crude caricatures to a globally respected form of art, exploring manga's most pivotal milestones, its biggest hits, its most legendary creators, and much, much more. But before we get started with this one, please consider leaving a like and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in having more content like this in your feed in the future. Also, feel free to check out the Patreon page linked below, should you be interested in supporting the creation of these kinds of videos even more. But for now, it is time to start exploring the history and the evolution of manga. Nara Prefecture, Japan. Not only is this place the home of Japan's oldest capital, the city of Nara, it is generally a place that is just bursting at the seams with history. What you will find here, among many other incredible sights, are the Nanto Shichi Daichi, the 7 great temples of the southern capital, all commissioned by the imperial court between the 6th and 8th century AD. The Hōryū-ji Temple, located in the town of Ikaruga and completed in 607 AD at the request of Prince Shotoku, is particularly noteworthy. Its main hall, reconstructed around 1300 years ago after a fire burned down the whole temple complex in 670 AD, is considered to be the oldest known wooden building in the entire world. Now, this is certainly pretty cool and all, but this is a video about the evolution of manga. So, what in the hell are we doing here? Well, you see, when the temple's roof was renovated in 1930, a fascinating discovery was made. Hidden beneath the ceiling boards was a set of caricatures drawn onto the temple's ceiling beams, believed to depict one of the construction workers who rebuilt the temple following the devastating fire in 670 AD. An artwork that was perhaps created out of sheer boredom by one of his colleagues during a break. By the way, images of these particular drawings seem to be kinda hard to find online. Maybe because there was yet another fire at the temple in 1949. Regardless, the fact that these were caricatural, perhaps even humorous drawings means that they are considered by some to be the earliest precursor of the modern manga. Obviously, this is far from what we now consider to be manga. But considering that the art form was, after all, the result of a centuries-long evolution, I think it's not completely wrong to at least give a mention to the ceiling beams of Hōryū-ji when speaking about the history of manga. The next stop on our journey through manga history takes us to the 12th century and to yet another temple, Kyoto's Kozanji. This temple is in possession of a set of 4 very significant emakimono, or picture scrolls, titled Chōjū-Giga. Now this is a lot more like it, isn't it? The first of the Chōjū-Giga Scrolls in particular is very famous. It features a collection of different animals partaking in human activities, all drawn in a very unique style for the time, which utilized incredibly expressive faces to convey emotion. Much like the ceiling beam drawings of Hōryū-ji, these drawings were meant to be caricatures. More specifically, they were meant to poke fun at the Japanese priests at the time. And actually, it was also a priest who eventually became most commonly credited with creating them. Toba-e, a high-ranking priest and painter from the 1100s who is said to have been the artist behind at least the first two scrolls of Chōjū-Giga. This claim is now considered to be somewhat dubious though, as there is a severe lack of actual evidence to suggest that this was indeed the work of Toba-e. But whoever created the Scrolls of Frolicking Animals, as they are often referred to in English, they were pretty ahead of their time in creating this charming and very expressive piece of artwork. Whether or not this is actually the first manga ever created, as is so often claimed, well, that is a whole nother story, especially since the actual word manga didn't appear anywhere in written text until several centuries after the creation of Chōjū-Giga. Regardless, much like the caricatures found in Nara Prefecture, these scrolls definitely deserve at least a mention when speaking about the origins of manga, not least because it ended up greatly influencing a certain art style that has a much more clear-cut connection to what eventually transformed into the modern manga, the Toba-e style. This style didn't actually quite catch on with a wider audience until the arrival of the Edo period, and more specifically the 1700s and the 1800s. This was of course hundreds of years after the creation of Chōjū-Giga, and the priest Toba-e had, quite obviously, long since passed away at that point. The Toba-e style is said to be named after him though, and with Toba-e long believed to have been the creator of the Frolicking Animal Scrolls, it makes sense too. The Toba-e style resembles the scrolls down to a T. Rough, comical sketches with a certain amount of satire contained within them. Figures were drawn with long limbs and exaggerated facial features and expressions. Simpler brushstrokes and light colors are used as well, that, combined with the more lighthearted, humorous nature of Toba-e, gave these pictures a unique character that certainly presented an interesting alternative to the more artistic ukiyo-e-style woodblock prints that were so popular throughout the Edo period. Popular were also some of the artists who embraced the minimalist, carefree nature of the Toba-e style. Among its practitioners were artists from famous schools like that of Utagawa, and most notably the master himself, Katsushika Hokusai. What made Hokusai one of Japan's most beloved artists were of course his incredible, highly detailed and artistic ukiyo-e style prints that eventually made him a legend the world over. But Hokusai didn't limit himself to elaborate woodblock print masterpieces either. In the 1810s, he released a couple of books filled with simple sketches, which were supposed to introduce his style to the general population of Japan, outside of the city of Edo, Japan's capital not just in the literal sense, but also in terms of art. The most successful of these Hokusai sketchbooks carried the title Hokusai Manga. The word manga, though, consisting of these two kanji letters, it has a somewhat complicated history. The many literal translations that I mentioned in the beginning of this video are perhaps, well, too literal. If you really want to dig deep into the history of the combination of these two characters, then you'll be able to find some pretty old Chinese written texts that do make use of them in this exact combination. In that case though, they describe neither a comic book nor a sketch drawing, but a kind of bird who likes to draw on the water surface with its beak while hunting for fish. The first known Japanese language use of these two characters in combination came in Santo Kyoden's 1798 picture book titled Shichi no Yukikai, where they were best translated as simply sketching or drawing. Now, if we really want to attach a literal meaning to the characters manga in the title Hokusai Manga, then perhaps free-spirited pictures, emphasizing the fun, unrestrained style that they were drawn in, would be most accurate. What's important to remember though is that the use of the word manga, while certainly popularized and brought into the public conscience in no small part by the great success of Hokusai's sketchbooks, had at that point still nothing to do with the concept of a comic book. Because what was missing from Hokusai's idea of the word manga in comparison to the modern meaning is the complete lack of a story that connects the drawings found within his sketchbooks. They are what they are, simple, light-hearted sketches with no overarching plot or dialogue taking place whatsoever. At least in my opinion, a way more interesting link between Hokusai and the modern idea of manga actually comes a few decades before the release of the Hokusai Manga. In the 1880s and 1890s, when during his early career, he aided the production of so-called kibiyoshi picture books. These kibiyoshi books, if you really think about it, are basically prototype comic books featuring large illustrations interspersed with gripping narratives and dialogue. And not only did Hokusai provide illustrations for these kinds of books, he's also said to have created the stories for some of them. The kibiyoshi book had actually been around in one form or another since the late 1700s, and I mean honestly, it's impossible to look at this and not see a resemblance to today's manga. So in a sense, all the elements to create what we know as manga were already there by the early 19th century. The concept of mixing narrative with illustrations like the kibiyoshi picture books did, the actual word manga that, while still carrying a different meaning than it does now, saw more use than ever before thanks to Hokusai and some of his contemporaries, and of course an audience that was always looking for new ways of keeping themselves entertained. So, when did it all start coming together? About half a century after Hokusai released his manga sketchbooks, Japan's self-imposed isolation and the Edo period came to a sudden end. More foreigners than ever now flooded into Japan, with Yokohama serving as one of the most popular destinations for foreign visitors of all kinds. One of these visitors, an Englishman by the name of Charles Workman, arrived in 1861. The 30-year-old Workman, who came to Japan as an artist and foreign correspondent for the Illustrated London News, would end up staying in Japan for the rest of his life, taking part in several different business ventures that included English and art classes, a photo studio, and most importantly, a little magazine called Japan Punch. Japan Punch, based on the English magazine Punch, included cartoons that satirized current events and politics especially, in the hopes of appealing to Yokohama's and Japan's fast-growing community of foreign visitors and inhabitants. What actually ended up happening was that the Japanese became increasingly fascinated with Workman's illustrations and political commentary, which spawned so many Japanese imitators that by the late 1860s, the word ponchie, named after Workman's Japan Punch magazine, became a word that described the fast-growing amount of Japanese prints that served as political commentary and satire. Workman also acted as a tutor to many up-and-coming Japanese artists, bringing to Japan for the first time the Western cartooning techniques that would later become super influential in shaping the modern manga. While Workman was working on his own magazine geared mainly towards Japan's foreign population, cartoon magazines made by the Japanese for the Japanese soon flooded the market, like the incredibly short-lived Eishinbun Nipponji from 1874, or the Maru-Maru Jinbun, which ran from 1877 until 1907. During its 30-year run, the Maru-Maru Jinbun and its political cartoons proved to be quite influential, reaching a circulation of around 150,000 at its peak. This magazine also employed a certain Frenchman by the name of Georges Bigot. Would you look at this f***ing weeb? I love this guy. Bigot came to Yokohama around 2 decades after Workman arrived in the city, and his story is quite similar to that of the Englishman as well. He gave classes on Western-style watercolor painting and worked as an illustrator before eventually founding his own satirical magazine called Toba-e, a reference to both the Toba-e style and the frolicking animal scrolls of Toba Sojo. Toba-e magazine was short-lived, lasting only around 3 years. But despite that, it is said to have introduced to the Japanese a style of panel arrangement and narrative sequencing that was completely new to them at the time. One of the biggest and most influential publications of late 1800s and early 1900s Japan was the Chichi Shinpo newspaper. In 1900, just as Japanese-made comics were really starting to take shape and take off in terms of popularity, the Chichi Shinpo started including in its Sunday edition a supplement titled Chichi Manga. The influence of Chichi Manga, which ran for over 500 issues by the way, cannot be overstated. Not least because it was in this supplement that Japan was introduced to the work of a man who is now widely considered to be the true father of manga, Kitazawa Rakuten. Kitazawa, who is also credited with being the first person to use the word manga in the modern sense. You know, Japanese comics, got his start at Chichi Manga with a little story titled Tagosaku to Mokube no Tokyo Kenbutsu, or Tagosaku and Mokube's Tokyo Trip, featuring two main characters from rural Japan who go on a sightseeing trip in Tokyo. It was a huge success that made Kitazawa Rakuten a household name in Japan. Another one of his successful works from the early 1900s, Chameto de Kobo, actually spawned a series of dolls and playing cards that serves as one of the earliest examples of character merchandising in Japan. Truly ahead of its time. Kitazawa then went on to start a couple of his own magazines, among them 1905's Tokyo Puck, a widely successful satirical comic magazine that also just so happens to be Japan's very first full-color publication as well. Notably, the Tokyo Puck also employed a certain Shimokawa Oten, one of Kitazawa's students who went on to create not necessarily the first Japanese animated movie ever made, but the first one to be shown in a public theater, making it, in the eyes of many, the first true anime. Unfortunately, no images or video footage of this film whatsoever have survived, making it lost media. Still, the fact that Kitazawa had somewhat of a hand in the evolution not only of manga, but also anime really speaks volumes about the man's influence. Besides his work in satirical comics for the Tokyo Puck, which was obviously aimed at an adult audience, Kitazawa also tried his hand at children's literature with his magazine Kodomo no Tomo, The Children's Companion, launched in 1914. Magazines aimed at the children's market weren't exactly a new idea at that point. The first of its kind was Iwaya Sasanami's Shonen Seikai, which ran from 1895 until 1914. Many others then followed in its footsteps, including Japan's first ever girls' magazine, Shochokai, from 1902. These magazines contained articles, text stories, and most importantly, picture stories. The picture stories found in these magazines were more or less an evolution of something known as e-monogatari, literally picture stories, which traditionally featured a unique layout where the text was positioned beneath the accompanying image, before then increasingly being integrated into the illustration itself as seen in manga strips from the early 20th century, already bringing it much closer to the style seen in Western comic books. The fusion of the Japanese and the Western style then really started coming together in the 1920s. In 1923, the Asahi Graph magazine released a 13-page comic titled Shōchan no Boken, perhaps the first ever Japanese publication to utilize the famous speech balloons first introduced to the Japanese by Charles Workman half a century earlier. The layout of the modern manga was finally starting to take shape when in 1931, manga got its first long-running hit series. Tagawa Suiho's Norakuro Nito Zotsu, first published in Kodansha's Shonen Club magazine, told the story of Norakuro, a black and white anthropomorphic dog serving as a soldier in an army of dogs, clearly based on the Japanese Imperial Army. It was supposed to run for only a year. Its somewhat unexpected success, however, kept it alive year after year after year. Until after a while, the story of Norakuro had turned more and more into nothing more than a sort of propaganda tool for the Japanese army, which was at the time waging a brutal war against China. Remarkably, the Norakuro series lasted well into the post-war era though, with its conclusion not arriving until 1981, an incredible 50 years after it was first published in Shonen Club magazine. Publication was interrupted only briefly between 1941 and the end of World War II, when Japan's manga industry was halted to conserve paper for the war effort. Tagawa's creation was a success outside of manga strips and books as well, spawning a wildly successful line of merchandise that is still going strong to this day, 2 anime TV series, and a whole museum devoted to its legendary creator. Despite its dark history as a former propaganda tool, Norakuro also undeniably represented a pivotal moment in manga history as the medium's first true nationwide mega hit, and is now considered to be one of the classics of the medium. But being the first doesn't necessarily mean being the only one. At the same time, the Tagawa's anthropomorphic dog soldier promoted the war to children all over Japan. Newspaper cartoonist Sakamoto Gajo made sure to deliver his own super successful series of manga strips. His series titled Tanku Tankuro and its eponymous main character, a robot with a round iron shell that allowed him to transform into ships, drilling rigs, and everything else that the author and his young readership could come up with in their minds, was the first successful science fiction manga and a great source of inspiration for some of post-war Japan's most important manga artists. Stepping into the footsteps of works like Norakuro and Tanku Tankuro, the post-war era was when the manga industry really started hitting its stride, pumping out one hit after another basically as soon as the war ended. And all that despite how incredibly poor the Japanese population was at the time. But ironically, this incredible poverty that swept across Japan in many ways helped push manga to the next level of popularity. A tankobon, the typical manga book format that first started appearing in the 1930s, collecting multiple comic strips into one handy volume, was some of the cheapest entertainment available in the years following World War II, especially when compared to movie tickets and the likes. And even if a tankobon was still too expensive, there were other options, like the so-called akahon, or red books, shorter than a regular tankobon at 16 to 30 pages long, produced with worse quality paper and ink, but also much cheaper, starting at around 10 yen, or around 90 cents in today's money. Another budget-friendly option to read manga in post-war Japan was the kashibonya, a place where you could rent manga and read to your heart's content for only a few pennies. A concept that still lives on to this day with the famous manga cafes that can be found all over Japan. Besides their affordable pricing, the fact that manga was at that point geared mainly towards a younger audience was yet another aspect that aided the industry's post-war boom. At the time, the American occupation had to sign off on pretty much every piece of media that was to be released in Japan. Censorship was a big hurdle to overcome. But reading material made for children had the luxury of escaping most of it, meaning that manga artists had a lot of creative freedom in trying to give children a much-needed distraction from the harsh realities of post-war Japan. One such artist made his debut only a few months after Japan's official surrender to the Allied forces. In the January 4th, 1946 edition of Osaka's Mainichi Shokukumin Shimbun, a then 17-year-old Tezuka Osamu released his first professional work, a 4-panel strip titled Ma-chan no Nikicho. It was the beginning of a long, eventful career for Tezuka, a man now often referred to as the god of manga. And the guy certainly had a talent that must have been a gift from God. With the full support of his parents and inspired by the works of the aforementioned Kitasawa Rakuten, as well as Tagawa's Norakuro and Sakamoto's Tanku Tankuro, Tezuka had already been creating full-length manga for 8 years when Ma-chan no Nikicho made its debut. And remember, he was only 17 at that point. His first professional work was a success, but it was Shin Takarajima, or New Treasure Island, his first professional book-length project, which debuted in February of 1947, which not only elevated his career to a whole new level, but also marked the beginning of a post-war manga revolution. Like a true mangaka, Tezuka worked and worked and worked his ass off, producing a total of 700 manga titles and over 100 animated films and TV shows throughout his 43-year-long career, releasing one industry-defining work after another. Tezuka only stopped working when he passed away in 1989. Among the many creative masterpieces of Tezuka's long, important career, one managed to stand head and shoulders above the rest. His manga Astro Boy, making its debut in April of 1952, went on to become one of the most pivotal works in manga history. It ended up selling more than 100 million copies and spawned an anime TV series that is considered to be one of the most important and influential in that industry as well. To illustrate just how influential Astro Boy and Tezuka's body of work as a whole really was, those huge eyes that are now a staple of manga and anime seem to be the brainchild of Tezuka Osamu. Like many other manga artists before him, he was greatly inspired by Disney cartoons and animation, where a similar style of eyes had been in use for decades at that point. For example, just take a look at Donald Duck's side by side with Astro. The influence is pretty obvious. This also kind of proves that the oft-repeated notion that large anime eyes are nothing more than a result of some sort of Japanese envy towards the big eyes of the Westerners is completely unfounded. Big eyes immediately make a cartoon character look a lot more cute and friendly, and conveying emotion is also much easier if you draw him like this. And that's pretty much all there is to it. As you can see, Tezuka Osamu had an incredible influence on both manga and anime. But he wasn't the only one making waves in the post-war manga industry either. As mentioned before, a true manga revolution took place between the late 40s and the late 60s, and there were many artists who spearheaded this revolution alongside Tezuka. And for a while, some of them lived in the same apartment building as Tezuka Osamu too. In 1953, the Astro Boy creator moved into an apartment building called Tokiwaso, located in Tokyo's Toshima ward. With Tezuka acting as a sort of mentor to many creators, more and more young and talented manga artists joined him and moved into the Tokiwaso building as well, until one day it became known as the Manga Apartment. Among those who moved in was, for example, Hiro Terada, one of the earliest contributors to the sports manga genre that would become insanely popular over the following decades. For a while, the Manga Apartment was also home to the renowned duo Fujiko Fujio. Their manga Doraemon, clearly inspired by Sakamoto's Tanku Tankuro, went on to become a global phenomenon, captivating children worldwide and spawning a seemingly immortal merchandise empire as well. I personally never read or watched anything Doraemon related as a kid, but even I knew this character design long before even knowing its name. That is one iconic robot cat we're talking about here. An artist who never lived in a manga apartment, but one that without a doubt deserves a mention in the video about the evolution of manga, is Hasegawa Machiko, the manga princess who was not only one of the first female manga artists to hit the scene, but also one of the most successful of her era throughout the whole industry. Her 1946 slice-of-life smash-hit manga Sasae-san ran for 28 years, becoming one of the best-selling manga series in history with close to 90 million copies sold. Its anime adaptation, which first aired all the way back in 1969, is still ongoing to this day. With over 2,600 episodes as of the making of this video, Sasae-san is currently the world's longest-running animated TV series. What will come to an end first, the Sasae-san anime or Planet Earth? Give your prediction in the comments down below. While all of these amazing artists did their part in pushing the industry forward, newspapers and especially magazines, which as we've seen earlier had long been an integral part of the evolution of manga, still played a huge part in bringing manga to the masses in the latter half of the 20th century. In fact, magazines became arguably even more important to the manga industry than ever before, starting in the late 1950s. It was Sunday, March 17th, 1959, when both Kodansha's Weekly Shonen Magazine and Shogakukan's Weekly Shonen Sunday put their first issues on magazine stands across Japan. These two magazines ended up becoming two of the most important throughout the whole industry. Kodansha's Weekly Shonen Magazine introduced its readers to, among many others, series like 1989's Hachime no Ippo, 1997's Great Teacher Onizuka, and more recently both Tokyo Revengers and Blue Lock. Shogakukan's Weekly Shonen Sunday, on the other hand, was responsible for serializing the classic 1978 manga Urusei Yatsura and one of my personal all-time favorites, Aoyama Gosho's Meitantei Conan. known in the West as either Detective Conan or Case Closed. Currently one of the industry's all-time bestsellers with close to 300 million copies sold. And while we're on the topic of best-selling manga of all time, there is no way that we can just ignore Shueisha's weekly Shonen Jump magazine, launched in 1968 as simply Shonen Jump. This is the one that even those with only a passing interest in manga and anime probably know about. With 7.5 billion copies sold since its launch 56 years ago, Shonen Jump was the first magazine to serialize some of manga and anime's biggest ever hits. Captain Tsubasa, Slam Dunk, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Naruto, One Piece, Bleach. The list goes on and on and on. It's hard to imagine the industry nowadays if Shonen Jump never existed. Oh, and before you go and leave an angry comment, I am well aware that a little series called Dragon Ball was missing from that list. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here. And by the way, if you're interested in seeing the very first issue of Shonen Jump magazine in all its glory, I would like to highly recommend this super underrated video by fellow YouTuber Gaijin Guy. He goes through the whole thing, along the way translating and explaining the most interesting parts. It's a really cool watch if you have an hour to spare. What all these magazines have in common, I mean besides being incredibly important to the industry, is of course that strange little word, shonen. So what does it actually mean? Well, manga and anime are more or less divided into different categories, depending on their intended target audience. Shonen, which pretty much represents the biggest audience in the entire industry, aims for young boys between the ages of 9 and 18. Shoujo, on the other hand, targets the same age group but girls instead of boys. Then there's also Kodomo, or literally children's manga, Seinen for adult men, Chosei for adult women. You get the idea. Outside of that, one particularly interesting manga movement started forming in the mid-1950s. Sick of manga being viewed as light entertainment mainly for kids and adolescents, a couple of creative minds came together to create what author Helen McCarthy fittingly called manga's punk movement. Gekiga, or dramatic pictures, was to be a new type of manga subgenre, one that aimed to utilize manga to tell more serious, compelling stories, comparable to what could be found in movies at the time. The idea for Gekiga was first developed in 1954 by Tatsumi Yoshihiro, a 19-year-old talented artist working for a rental manga publisher. Together with a few other like-minded artists, he turned his idea of dramatic picture manga into a full-on movement, which also included a Gekiga workshop for artists curious in partaking in their vision. Gekiga wasn't necessarily some kind of underground manga genre either, though. Some of its creations ended up becoming commercially successful classics and mainstays of the industry. The best example of this is, without a doubt, Golgo 13. Created by Saito Takao, who had previously worked on manga adaptations of 4 different James Bond novels, Golgo 13 is the story of an assassin navigating a world of crime and corruption. It is a dark, violent, and serious story that represents a big shift in tone compared to other successful manga at the time. I can certainly see the appeal, and so could a lot of other people, because Golgo 13, starting publication in 1968, is still ongoing as of the making of this video, making it the longest running manga series in history. What will come to an end first, the Golgo 13 manga or Planet Earth? Give your prediction in the comments down below. At around the same time that Saito Takao introduced violence and serious plots to the world of manga, fellow creative mind Nagai Go had yet another innovative idea. Starting in 1968, he worked on Hōryū-ji Gakuen, one of the earliest manga stories to ever be serialized in Shonen Jump magazine and, more importantly, the first example of an erotic manga. Mild by today's standards, Hōryū-ji Gakuen set the stage for much naughtier stuff to follow, which eventually became known under terms like ecchi and of course hentai. As you can imagine, teenagers in the late 60s loved this shit. Parents and teachers hated it, but either way, even with Nagai later moving on to completely different kinds of projects, his perverted vision of what manga could be was definitely here to stay. It was also in the late 60s that manga slowly started to make its way to the West as well. It was the October 1969 issue of the French Budo magazine Europe that featured what is probably the first manga ever translated for a Western audience, Hirata Hiroshi's Bushido Musanden. A year later, in the US, a copy of Saito Takao's 0011 Napoleon Solo inspired Fred Patton and Richard Kyle to open their very own mail-order bookstore specializing in foreign comics. And so, in 1972, Graphic Story Bookshop, one of the first stores to bring imported manga to a larger American audience, was born. Patton and Kyle were truly ahead of their time too, because the first official release of a manga on US soil didn't come until 6 years later. In April of 1978, Barefoot Gen became the first manga to be officially published in the US. And what a great choice to start with. Released in Japan under its original title Hadashi no Gen in 1973, Barefoot Gen was created by a certain Nakazawa Keiji, an eyewitness and survivor of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. He was only 6 years old when the bombs were dropped. Barefoot Gen was based on Nakazawa's own experiences of surviving the atomic bombing, and having watched the movie version, I do highly recommend checking it out for yourself. But only if you're in the right mindset for it. It is very graphic, very depressing, but also serves as an important reminder of the horrors of war as told by someone who witnessed it all with the eyes of an innocent child. The release of Barefoot Gen was certainly groundbreaking in terms of bringing manga to a Western audience. But the true mega hits of the medium that managed to capture the hearts of the gaijin wouldn't arrive until the 1980s. Generally, the 1980s and later the 90s was when so many of the industry's greatest ever works hit the scene. Some of which I just have to at least quickly mention here, since due to time restraints I won't be able to go into detail about each and every one of them. But during these two incredible decades, you had stuff like Hokuto no Ken, also known in the West as Fist of the North Star, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Berserk, Sailor Moon, Yu Yu Hakusho, Ranma 1/2, the list goes on and on. But in the early 80s, before most of these incredible series came out, a young manga artist by the name of Toriyama Akira was working on Dr. Slump, a massively successful manga and anime, not only in Japan, but also overseas. The anime adaptation of Dr. Slump aired in places like Italy as early as 1983. But before even wrapping up Dr. Slump, Toriyama was already looking for ideas for his next big project, the one that would end up defining his entire career. Eventually, inspired by the Hong Kong martial arts movies of the 70s that he enjoyed so much, and the classic Chinese tale Journey to the West, Toriyama came up with the idea for Dragon Ball. The story of a young monkey-tailed boy from the woods called Son Goku who teams up with a girl named Bulma to collect the 7 Dragon Balls and summon the dragon Shenlong, who will grant any wish to those who manage to do so. Following its initial appearance in Weekly Shonen Jump's December 1984 issue, Dragon Ball became an instant smash hit. With a perfect blend of charming character design, a good sense of humor, intense fight scenes, and a simple-to-understand yet gripping story, it managed to become not only the blueprint of what a shonen manga should be from that point on, it eventually took the whole world by storm as well. Dragon Ball and its many sequels, including the legendary Dragon Ball Z, went on to sell a combined total of more than 300 million copies. Its 4 different anime TV series and 24 theatrical film adaptations proved to be even more successful. There is really no overstating the cultural impact that Dragon Ball had on multiple generations of kids and adults all over the world. I really don't think there's a single continent on this planet where DB isn't considered to be a cultural phenomenon. Except maybe Antarctica? Do they have Dragon Ball over there? I honestly wouldn't be surprised if they did. Dragon Ball's success and its incredible staying power even managed to outlast its creator. Toriyama's death in March of 2024 was mourned by fans worldwide who grew up idolizing Son Goku and his friends. And I gotta admit, while celebrity deaths rarely hit me that hard, the death of Toriyama was a tough pill to swallow. Toriyama's passing also spawned countless reactions from the entire manga industry, among them some of its most legendary artists, including Kishimoto Masashi and Oda Eiichiro. These two guys, and many others, but especially these two guys, really carried the torch in terms of keeping shonen manga relevant going into the new millennium. Their manga series, Naruto and One Piece, first serialized in 1999 and 1997 respectively, managed to do something that seemed almost impossible. Creating manga and anime franchises that matched and in some respects even surpassed the success and worldwide cultural appeal of Dragon Ball. One Piece especially proved to be an absolute manga and anime juggernaut. With more than 500 million copies sold, it is far and away the best-selling manga series of all time. And its anime adaptation, which is currently sitting at more than 1100 episodes as of the making of this video, not too shabby either. Going back to the early 1980s, while Toriyama Akira was making waves in the manga industry, there was yet another Akira looking to revolutionize the manga industry by doing something a bit different, something far away from the pages of Weekly Shonen Jump and the likes, something that ended up becoming legendary in its own right. It was the December 1982 issue of the adult-oriented Young magazine, which contained the debut of Otomo Katsuhiro's Akira, a post-apocalyptic cyberpunk masterpiece of a manga series that ran in the magazine for 8 years, along the way getting showered with praise and awards from fans and critics alike. Of course, what really pushed Akira over the edge in terms of achieving legendary status was its 1988 anime film adaptation, which gained the utmost respect of moviegoers and critics not just in Japan, but all over the world. What Dragon Ball did for shonen manga and anime, Akira did for the seinen adult demographic and especially Japanese animated film. It is now regarded as not only one of the most groundbreaking animated movies of all time, but one of the greatest movies ever made, period. Seriously, watching this thing side by side with other animated movies of its time honestly makes you think that the crew behind this movie must have traveled back in time from 10 years into the future or something. It's that good. Akira ended up spawning a wave of mature, cyberpunk-themed manga and anime that offered a nice little contrast to the insane amounts of shonen-style content that flooded the market at the same time. For example, stuff like Shiro Masamune's Ghost in the Shell, an incredibly influential piece of cyberpunk media in its own right, was clearly inspired by Otomo's work and further helped cement manga and anime in the West as more than just children's comics and cartoons, but as legitimate forms of art and expression that can easily compete with the finest pieces of literature and movies produced in the West. Nowadays, manga is obviously more internationally successful and more easily accessible than ever before. You can usually find at least a few tankobon manga books in nearly every bookstore all over the world. And the advent of online publication means that if you're interested, you can read pretty much whatever you want at the touch of a button, conveniently translated into your language, either officially or by the ever-growing international fanbase, which honestly must be one of the most passionate and dedicated fanbases in existence. I also truly believe that in manga, there is something entertaining or thought-provoking to be found for people of all different ages and walks of life. No matter if you are a kid or an adult that wishes to be a kid again. No matter if you like funny, light-hearted stories or those with a darker tone to it. No matter if you prefer light entertainment or something that makes you think. I say there are two types of people. Those who love manga, or those who don't know that they love it yet. And there you have it. That was the history and evolution of manga. Due to time constraints, I without a doubt missed out on mentioning some of your, and honestly even some of my own favorites. So drop your manga recommendations in the comments down below if you like. Something that I would like to mention before we end this video though are the names of my amazing Patreon supporters listed here, including Bobby Wu, Javier Soravia, Capybara Chuck, Turam, Daniel Dees, RK0, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yoko the Space Whale, Steve Matsui, Cats and Soup, and Charred B-Man. And to everyone who decided to watch this video all the way until the end, you know what it is. Thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.